The waiter had just placed the lobster thermidor in front of Marcus when he looked across the candlelit table at me and said the words that would seal his fate. "You know what, Helen? You're absolutely worthless. All you do is sit around the house spending my money while I work myself to death, building our future." He cut into his expensive meal with theatrical precision, not even bothering to look up as he delivered the killing blow. "Sometimes I wonder what I even married you for." Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. I smiled sweetly, took a sip of the Dom Perignon he'd ordered to impress the couple at the next table and said, "That's interesting, darling, because I just bought your dream car today." The fork stopped halfway to his mouth. "The 1967 Shelby Cobra you've been drooling over for 3 years? The one with the original 427 engine that costs more than most people's houses? Yes, that one. It's sitting in our driveway right now." Marcus went pale, his confident smirk melting like ice cream in August. Because you see, what my dear husband didn't know was that I had never spent a single penny of his money. Not ever. Every designer dress, every piece of jewelry, every luxury he thought he was funding, came from my own accounts. Accounts he knew nothing about because he'd never bothered to ask where a woman like me might get money of her own. Let me take you back to how this all began. My name is Helen Williams, and until 6 months ago, everyone, including my husband, believed I was just another trophy wife living off her successful spouse's generosity. The truth was so much more delicious than that. I met Marcus at a charity gala 3 years earlier. He was the rising star of Henderson and Associates, a prestigious law firm downtown, making partner at 32 with a corner office and a reputation for winning impossible cases. I was there as part of the event planning committee, quietly coordinating behind the scenes to ensure everything ran smoothly. When he approached me by the champagne fountain, I was adjusting my simple black dress and checking my phone for updates from the catering staff. "You look like you're working too hard for someone at a party," he said, flashing that $1,000,000 smile that had probably charmed countless juries. "I'm Marcus. Marcus Chen." I looked up at him, this confident man in his perfectly tailored tuxedo, and made a split-second decision that would change everything. "Helen Williams," I replied, not mentioning that I was actually the one who had donated the $250,000 that made this entire event possible. Just trying to make sure everyone has a good time. Marcus assumed I was hired help. When he discovered I was actually a guest, he was intrigued. When I let him buy me dinner the following week, wearing a dress that cost more than his monthly salary, he was smitten. And when I never corrected his assumption that I must work in something harmless like interior design or art curation, well, that's when things got interesting. You see, Marcus had a very specific type. He wanted a beautiful woman who would enhance his image, someone cultured enough to hold conversations at firm dinners, but dependent enough to never overshadow him. I fit that bill perfectly, or so he thought. What he didn't know was that I had graduated summa cum laude from Wharton at 21, built and sold 2 tech startups by 25, and had been quietly managing a portfolio worth over $50 million since my late 20s. My family had built their fortune in shipping 3 generations ago, but I'd tripled our wealth through strategic investments in emerging technologies. While Marcus was working 80-hour weeks to make partner, I was turning $100,000 seed investments into 8-figure returns. While he stressed about billable hours, I was having lunch meetings with venture capitalists and tech entrepreneurs who hung on my every word. But I never told him any of this. Not during our whirlwind courtship, not when he proposed with a 2-carat diamond he spent 6 months saving for, and certainly not when he insisted on a prenup to, quote, protect his assets. I signed it with a smile, knowing that the watch on my wrist cost more than his annual salary. The early days of our marriage were almost amusing. Marcus would come home exhausted from work, complaining about difficult clients and demanding partners, while I pretended to have spent my day shopping or getting my nails done. In reality, I had been in board meetings, conference calls with my investment managers, or reviewing acquisition proposals for companies Marcus had probably never heard of. He loved playing the successful provider. He'd hand me his credit card before I went shopping, insisting I buy myself something nice. I'd take it, of course, but I never used it. Instead, I'd return home with bags from boutiques that didn't even accept credit cards. places where you needed to be personally invited, and where they kept detailed records of your family's purchasing history going back decades. Marcus never questioned where the art on our walls came from, or how I seemed to know the perfect wines to pair with every meal, or why luxury car dealerships called me by my first name. He was too busy basking in the reflection of what he thought was his own success to notice that the woman he'd married was operating on an entirely different level. The house we lived in, the one he loved to call ours when showing off to his colleagues, was actually mine. Purchased with cash from a trust fund he didn't know existed. The cars in our garage, including the Tesla he drove to work every day, were registered in my name through one of my shell companies. Even the country club membership he was so proud of had been gifted to him anonymously by the board, which included 3 of my closest friends. I let him believe he was supporting me because it made him happy. There was something endearing about his pride when he'd slip his arm around my waist at firm events and introduce me as my wife, Helen. The way his chest puffed out when partners' wives complimented my jewelry or my dress, thinking he was the one who could afford such luxuries. I found his illusion charming, even sweet in its own way. But then the charm started to wear thin. It began with small comments about my spending, jokes about keeping me in the style I'd become accustomed to. Then came the suggestions that maybe I should think about getting a little job somewhere, something to keep me busy during the day. As if I wasn't already running 3 companies and sitting on the boards of 5 others. The breaking point started building 6 months ago when Marcus made senior partner. Suddenly, he wasn't just successful, he was powerful. And with that power came an ego that began to eclipse everything else. He started making decisions about our social calendar without consulting me, accepting invitations to events and declining others based on what would benefit his career. He began talking about our future in terms of his future, as if I was simply an accessory to be managed along with his other assets. The dinner tonight had been planned for weeks. Marcus wanted to celebrate his latest victory, a high-profile case that had made the front page of the business section. He'd chosen the restaurant, ordered the wine, and spent most of the meal talking about himself, while I smiled and nodded in all the right places. But when the conversation turned to the future, something shifted. Marcus started talking about the sacrifices he'd made to get where he was, how hard he'd worked to provide the life we enjoyed. He talked about me as if I was a burden he'd graciously chosen to bear, a beautiful but expensive pet who contributed nothing but looked good on his arm. I sometimes wonder, he said, cutting into his lobster with unnecessary force, what it would be like to be married to someone who actually contributed something. Someone with ambition, you know. Drive. I sipped my champagne and watched him, this man who thought he knew.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story.
Me, who believed he had the right to diminish me because he'd never bothered to discover who I actually was. What kind of contribution did you have in mind? I asked sweetly. Marcus shrugged, warming to his theme. I don't know. A career. Income. Something that shows you're more than just. He waved his hand vaguely in my direction. This. That's when he called me worthless. That's when I told him about the car. And that's when I realized it was time for Marcus to learn exactly who he'd married. The Shelby Cobra had been Marcus's obsession for as long as I'd known him. He had pictures of it saved on his phone, articles bookmarked about its restoration, dreams of owning one someday when he'd, quote, made it big enough. He talked about it the way other men talked about winning the lottery or climbing Everest, as the ultimate symbol of having achieved everything he'd ever wanted. What Marcus didn't know was that I'd been watching the classic car market for months, waiting for the right moment. When a 1967 Shelby Cobra 427 came up for auction last week, one of only 23 ever made, I knew it was time. The bidding started at $2 million. I won it for $4.7 million, paying cash through one of my investment companies. I had it delivered today while Marcus was at work, timing it perfectly for maximum impact. The delivery team had specific instructions to park it in our circular driveway where it would be impossible to miss, right next to Marcus's Tesla that suddenly looked like a toy by comparison. Now, watching his face drain of color as he processed what I'd just told him, I felt a familiar thrill. It was the same feeling I got when a startup I'd invested in went public, or when a merger I'd orchestrated closed successfully. The satisfaction of a plan, executed flawlessly. "You're joking," Marcus said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "You can't be serious. That car costs more than I make in 3 years. 4.7 million to be exact," I replied, taking another sip of champagne. "But who's counting?" Marcus set down his fork, his expensive dinner forgotten. "Helen, what have you done? We can't afford that. I can't afford that. Do you have any idea what this will do to our finances?" I smiled at him across the table, my husband of 3 years, who thought he knew everything about money and success and power. "Oh, darling," I said softly, "we need to talk." The drive home was silent except for the sound of Marcus's labored breathing. I could practically hear the gears turning in his head as he tried to figure out how his simple, decorative wife had managed to purchase a car worth more than his entire net worth. He kept stealing glances at me as I drove my Bentley, a car he'd always assumed was leased through some arrangement he didn't need to understand. When we pulled into our driveway, the Cobra was waiting for us like a beautiful blue and white predator, its chrome gleaming under the security lights. Marcus got out of the car slowly, walking toward it, as if it might disappear if he moved too quickly. He ran his hands along the hood with something approaching reverence, then turned to look at me with an expression I'd never seen before. "How?" was all he managed to say. I unlocked our front door and gestured for him to follow me inside. "Would you like a drink?" "I think we're going to need one for this conversation." Marcus nodded mutely and followed me to the living room, where I poured 2 glasses of the 30-year-old Macallan he kept for special occasions. He accepted his glass but didn't drink, just stared at me as if he was seeing me for the first time. "The car is real," I began, settling into the leather chair across from him. "I bought it this morning. With my own money. Money that I earned myself, through investments and business ventures you've never bothered to ask me about." Marcus blinked. "What investments? What business ventures?" "Helen, you don't work." "Don't I?" I smiled and pulled out my phone, scrolling to the contact list. Should I call Rebecca Martinez and tell her I don't work? She's the CEO of Martinez Tech, the startup I helped fund that went public last month. Or maybe David Chang at Chang Industries? I sit on his board of directors. Oh, or perhaps Sarah Williams at Williams Aerospace. She's my cousin, and I own 30% of her company. With each name I mentioned, Marcus's face grew paler. These weren't random people I was making up. They were names he recognized from the business pages. Companies whose success stories he'd read about in Forbes and the Wall Street Journal. "That's impossible," he whispered. "I would have known. You would have told me." "Would I?" I leaned back in my chair, studying his face. "When, exactly, would I have told you? During one of our dinner conversations where you talked about your cases for 2 hours straight? Or maybe during one of those firm parties where you introduced me as just my wife, and then spent the evening networking while I made small talk with the other wives about charity work and yoga classes?" Marcus set down his glass with shaking hands. "But the prenup. You signed a prenup. You agreed that what's mine stays mine, and what's yours stays yours." "Yes, I did." I smiled wider. "Best decision I ever made, actually. It means you have no claim to any of my assets. Not the house we're sitting in, which I own outright. Not the cars in our garage, which are registered to my companies. Not the art on our walls, which I purchased from my personal collection. And certainly not the $53 million currently sitting in my various investment accounts." The number hit Marcus like a physical blow. He actually stumbled backward, catching himself on the arm of the sofa. 53 million? Give or take a few $100,000. The markets were volatile today. I stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the Cobra sitting in our driveway. "You know what's funny, Marcus? You've spent 3 years talking about providing for me, about supporting me, about all the sacrifices you've made to give me this lifestyle. But you've never once asked me how I spent my days, what I was passionate about, or what I might want to contribute to our partnership." Marcus was quiet for a long moment, processing everything I'd told him. When he finally spoke, his voice was small and confused. Why didn't you tell me? Why let me believe? That you were the successful one? That I was dependent on you? I turned back to face him. Because you needed to believe it. Your entire sense of self-worth was built on being the provider, the successful husband with the beautiful wife who relied on him for everything. I thought it was harmless, even endearing. A little white lie that made you happy and didn't hurt anyone. But it was all fake, Marcus said, his voice growing stronger, more accusatory. Our entire marriage was built on a lie. Was it? I walked back to my chair and sat down, crossing my legs elegantly. I never lied to you, Marcus. I never claimed to be unemployed or dependent. You made assumptions, and I simply didn't correct them. There's a difference. Marcus stood up abruptly, pacing across the room. This is insane. You're telling me that my wife, who I thought was a typical housewife, is actually some sort of business mogul? That while I've been killing myself at the firm, you've been out there making millions? Not making millions, darling. Making tens of millions. And yes, while you've been working 80-hour weeks to make partner, I've been building an empire you never bothered to notice. The anger was starting to show in Marcus's face now, replacing the shock and confusion. So what was tonight about? Some kind of test? A way to humiliate me? Tonight was about truth, I said simply. You called me worthless, Marcus. You said I contributed nothing to our marriage, that I was just an expensive burden you'd graciously chosen to bear. I thought it was time you learned exactly what I've contributed. Marcus stopped pacing and turned to face me, his jaw clenched. So you bought a $5 million car to prove a point? I bought a car I wanted with money I earned to celebrate a business deal I closed this morning. The timing was just fortunate. I smiled at him sweetly. Would you like to know what the deal was? I just acquired a controlling interest in Henderson and Associates, your firm, Marcus. As of this morning, I'm your boss. If the car had been a shock, this revelation was a nuclear bomb. Marcus actually staggered, gripping the back of the sofa for support. That's impossible. The firm isn't for sale. Wasn't for sale, I corrected. But when the senior partners were facing a cash flow crisis due to some rather expensive litigation they've been keeping quiet, they became very interested in a silent investor who could provide immediate liquidity in exchange for controlling interest. I made them an offer they couldn't refuse. Marcus was staring at me now like I was a complete stranger, which in many ways, I suppose I was. You bought my firm, I saved your firm, and by extension your career. You're welcome, by the way. The implications were starting to sink in, and I could see Marcus's mind racing. How long have you known about the financial problems? About 6 months. Around the time you started making senior partner, actually. It's amazing what you can learn when you have the right connections and know which questions to ask. Marcus sank back onto the sofa, his head in his hands. Jesus Christ, Helen. Do you realize what this means? You own the firm where I work. You're essentially my employer. Among other things, yes. How is any of this legal? How did you even know about the firm's problems? I leaned forward slightly, enjoying the moment. Do you remember David Chang, the one I mentioned earlier? Chang Industries handles most of your firm's technology infrastructure. When they started having trouble paying their bills, David called me for advice. That's when I learned about Henderson and Associates' cash flow issues. Marcus looked up at me, his eyes wide with a mixture of awe and fear. You've been planning this. I've been paying attention. There's a difference. I stood up and walked to the bar cart, refreshing my drink. You see, Marcus, while you've been viewing our marriage as a traditional arrangement where you provide and I consume, I've been viewing it as a partnership. I've been quietly ensuring that both our futures are secure, that both our careers flourish. By secretly buying my firm, by investing in what matters to you. The firm was struggling, you were stressed about the financial instability even if you didn't want to admit it, and I had the resources to solve the problem. So I did. Marcus was quiet for a long time, staring at his hands. When he finally looked up at me, there was something different in his expression. Not anger anymore, but something more complex. Why are you telling me all this now? Why not just let me keep believing what I believed? I sat back down, considering how to answer. Because calling me worthless crossed a line, Marcus. Because treating me like an expensive pet rather than an equal partner became unbearable. And because I realized that our marriage was never going to grow into something real, as long as you saw me as less than what I actually am. So what happens now? Marcus asked quietly. Where do we go from here? I smiled at him, but there was no warmth in it. That depends entirely on you. Marcus spent the next 3 days walking around our house like a man in a dream, touching things with new eyes, as if seeing them for the first time. Which, in a way, he was. The Ming Dynasty vase in our foyer that he'd always admired suddenly took on new meaning when he realized it wasn't a reproduction I'd picked up at some high-end furniture store, but an authentic piece worth more than his annual salary. The original Rothko hanging in our dining room wasn't a print he'd assumed I'd splurged on during one of my shopping sprees, but an actual painting I'd acquired at auction 3 years before we met. I watched him discover these truths with a mixture of amusement and something that might have been pity. Every morning, he'd come downstairs for coffee and pause at something new, studying it with the dawning realization that his entire understanding of our life together had been fundamentally wrong. The crystal chandelier above our breakfast table wasn't from some upscale home goods store. It was baccarat, custom-made, and worth more than the down payment on most people's houses. The Persian rug in our living room wasn't a decorative splurge, but a 16th-century masterpiece that museums had tried to buy from me. On Thursday morning, I found him standing in my walk-in closet, staring at a row of handbags with an expression of bewildered recognition. "These are all real, aren't they?" he said without turning around. "The Birkin bags, the Chanel, the limited editions. They're not knockoffs or gifts or anything like that. You bought them yourself." "Every single one," I confirmed, adjusting the strap of my watch. A vintage Patek Philippe that had belonged to my grandmother. Though, to be fair, some of them were gifts. From myself to myself. Usually after closing a particularly profitable deal. Marcus turned to face me, his eyes scanning the closet that was larger than most people's bedrooms, taking in the organized rows of designer shoes, the carefully curated collection of jewelry in its climate-controlled display cases, the evening gowns that had been custom-made by couturiers whose waiting lists stretched for years. How did I not see this? How did I live with you for 3 years and not realize that none of this was normal? Because you saw what you expected to see, I replied gently. You expected to see a wife who depended on her successful husband's generosity, so that's what you saw. The human mind is remarkably good at filtering out information that doesn't fit our existing beliefs. He picked up a small velvet box from one of the jewelry displays, opening it to reveal a pair of diamond earrings that caught the morning light like captured stars. These must be worth 200,000, give or take. I took the box from his hands and returned it to its place. They were a closing gift to myself when I sold my second startup. The buyer was particularly difficult to work with, and I felt I deserved something sparkly for my patience. Marcus sat down heavily on the small velvet bench in the center of the closet, his head in his hands. I feel like I'm losing my mind, Helen. Everything I thought I knew about our life, about you, about myself, it's all wrong. I sat down beside him, close enough to offer comfort, but not so close as to crowd him. Not wrong, exactly. Incomplete. You knew that I was intelligent, that I had good taste, that I could hold my own in any social situation. You knew that I was loyal and supportive, and that I cared about your success. None of that was fake. But you were pretending to be someone else entirely. I was allowing you to believe what you needed to believe. There is a difference. I stood up and walked to the window that looked out over our garden, where a team of landscapers was maintaining the elaborate topiary maze I'd had installed the year before Marcus and I met. When we first started dating, you were so proud of being able to take me to nice restaurants, to buy me gifts, to show me off to your colleagues. It made you happy to feel like you were providing for me. I didn't want to take that away from you. Marcus looked up at me, his expression a mixture of hurt and confusion. So you lied to protect my feelings? I omitted certain details to preserve your sense of self-worth. which, considering what you said to me at dinner the other night, may have been a mistake. The silence stretched between us, filled with the sound of the gardeners working outside and the distant hum of traffic from the main road. Finally, Marcus spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. What happens to us now? How do we move forward from this? It was a fair question, and one I'd been considering for the past few days. The truth was, I wasn't entirely sure. The marriage we'd had was built on a foundation that no longer existed. Marcus could never again feel like the successful provider taking care of his dependent wife, because now he knew the reality was exactly the opposite. And I could never again pretend to be the grateful recipient of his generosity, because the charade had finally become too exhausting to maintain. I don't know, I admitted, but I think the first step is for you to understand exactly who you married, and for me to understand who you really are when you're not performing the role of the magnanimous husband. Marcus stood up slowly, as if testing whether his legs would support him. Where do we start? With honesty, I said simply. Complete, uncomfortable, potentially relationship-ending honesty. Over the next week, we began the painful process of deconstructing our marriage and rebuilding it on a foundation of truth. I started by showing Marcus my home office, a room he'd always assumed was just a pretty space, where I paid bills and planned dinner parties. In reality, it was the nerve center of a business empire that spanned 3 continents and employed over 2,000 people. The wall-mounted monitors displayed real-time data from the various companies I owned, or had significant stakes in. The phones that rang constantly weren't social calls, but urgent communications from CEOs, investment managers, and board members, who sought my input on everything from merger negotiations to hostile takeover defenses. The filing cabinets that Marcus had never bothered to open contained contracts worth hundreds of millions of dollars, acquisition agreements that had reshaped entire industries, and correspondence with some of the most powerful people in business and politics. "This is what you do all day?" Marcus asked, staring at a contract I'd been reviewing for the potential acquisition of a renewable energy company. "While I thought you were getting manicures and having lunch with friends, you were actually running multinational corporations?" "Some days," I confirmed. "Other days I was having lunch with friends who happened to be Fortune 500 CEOs, or getting manicures while conducting conference calls with investment bankers. I'm quite good at multitasking." Marcus picked up a framed photograph from my desk, a picture of me shaking hands with the Secretary of Commerce at a White House event honoring innovative entrepreneurs. "When was this taken?" "Last year. I was being recognized for my work in supporting women-owned startups in developing markets." I glanced at the photo, remembering the day. "You were working late that night, so I went alone. You told me you were attending a charity gala." "I was." The recognition ceremony was part of a larger fundraising event for educational initiatives in Southeast Asia. I donated $5 million that night. Marcus set the photo down carefully as if it might explode. $5 million. It was tax-deductible. And the cause was important to me. I pulled up another file on my computer, showing him the spreadsheet where I tracked my charitable giving. I donate between 15% and 20% of my annual income to various causes: education, women's rights, environmental protection, disaster relief. Last year alone, I gave away approximately $12 million. $12 million! Marcus was beginning to sound like a broken record, repeating numbers as if saying them aloud would help him process their magnitude. "Helen, I had no idea. Not just about the money, but about any of this. The scope of what you do, the impact you have, the responsibility you carry. How could you have known?" I asked. Not unkindly. "You never asked. In 3 years of marriage, you never once inquired about my interests, my goals, my work, or my passions. You assumed I didn't have any that mattered." The accusation hung in the air between us, and I could see Marcus struggling with it. Part of him wanted to deny it, to defend himself, but the evidence was overwhelming. He'd been content to believe that I was beautiful but vapid, cultured but unambitious, supportive but ultimately inconsequential. "You're right," he said finally. I never asked because I never thought there was anything important to ask about. I saw you as... He paused, searching for the right words. An accessory, I supplied. A beautiful object that enhanced your image and made your life more pleasant, but didn't have an independent existence worth exploring. Marcus winced, but he didn't deny it. God, when you put it like that, it sounds horrible. It was horrible, but it was also understandable, in a way. Society conditions us to see women in certain roles, and successful men often gravitate toward partners who confirm their sense of superiority rather than challenge it. You're not the first man to prefer a wife who makes him feel important, rather than one who might overshadow him. Is that what you think happened? That I married you because I thought you'd never be more successful than me? I considered the question carefully. I think you married me because I was beautiful and charming, and made you look good to your colleagues and friends. I think you stayed married to me because I never threatened your sense of being the dominant partner in our relationship. And I think you started resenting me because you began to feel guilty about not loving me enough to actually see me. The analysis was harsh but fair, and Marcus didn't attempt to argue with it. Instead, he sat down in my desk chair and stared at the monitors showing the real-time performance of my various investments. So what now? Do we get divorced? Do we try to rebuild this marriage on completely different terms? Do we just acknowledge that we never really knew each other and call it quits? Those are all options, I agreed. But before we make any decisions, I think you need to understand the full scope of what's changed. I spent the next hour walking Marcus through the details of my business empire. I showed him the organizational charts of the companies I owned outright, the board positions I held at major corporations, the venture capital fund I'd started to support emerging technologies. I explained how I'd identified and invested in artificial intelligence startups 5 years before they became mainstream, how I'd predicted the shift towards sustainable energy and positioned my portfolio accordingly, how I'd recognized the potential of blockchain technology when most people still thought it was just about cryptocurrency. The Henderson and Associates acquisition, I said, pulling up the relevant files, was actually one of my smaller deals this year. I bought controlling interest for $45 million, which represented about 3% of my liquid assets at the time. Marcus stared at the acquisition documents bearing his firm's letterhead. 3%. The Shelby Cobra was more expensive, proportionally speaking. But I've wanted one for years, and when the opportunity arose, it seemed like the perfect way to make a point. What point exactly? I turned to face him fully, my expression serious. That you don't know me at all, Marcus. That you've been living with a woman you've never bothered to understand. Married to someone whose true nature you've never even attempted to discover. That your assumptions about who I am and what I'm capable of are so fundamentally wrong that they've made our entire relationship a lie. The words hit their target, and I could see Marcus absorbing the full weight of what I was saying. So the question now is whether you want to get to know the real me, or whether you'd prefer to continue living with the fantasy you've created. Marcus was quiet for a long time, staring at the documents scattered across my desk. When he finally spoke, his voice was subdued but determined. I want to know you, the real you. I want to understand what I've been missing all this time. Are you sure? I asked. Because the real me is not the supportive, deferential wife you married. The real me has opinions about everything, runs companies that compete with firms like yours, makes decisions that affect thousands of people's livelihoods, and has zero patience for being patronized or dismissed. The real me might be more than you bargained for. Marcus met my eyes for the first time in days, and I saw something there I hadn't seen before. Not the confident arrogance he'd always worn like armor, but genuine curiosity mixed with what might have been respect. Try me. So I did. Over the following days, I began to share the details of my actual life with my husband. I told him about the board meeting where I'd convinced a reluctant CEO to pivot his company's entire business model, saving it from bankruptcy and creating thousands of new jobs. I explained the complex financial engineering behind a merger I'd orchestrated between two rival tech companies, creating a new industry giant while ensuring that neither company's workforce faced layoffs. I showed him the emails from entrepreneurs around the world, women who'd started businesses with funding from my venture capital firm and were now employing hundreds of people in their home countries. I shared the thank you letters from scholarship recipients, brilliant students who were able to attend university because of educational programs I'd established in underserved communities. This is what I do with my days, I told him, pulling up a video call with a young woman in Kenya who was using my funding to bring solar power to rural villages. While you thought I was shopping for shoes, I was helping to electrify communities that had never had reliable power before. Marcus watched the video with fascination, seeing me conduct the call in fluent Swahili, discussing technical specifications and implementation timelines with the same ease I'd once used to plan dinner parties. You speak Swahili? Swahili, Mandarin, French, Portuguese, and Spanish. You pick up languages when you do business in as many countries as I do. I closed the laptop and turned to face him. The question is, how does it feel to discover that your wife is not the person you thought she was? Marcus was quiet for a moment, processing everything he'd learned. Honestly, it's terrifying. And amazing. And completely overwhelming. He paused, then added, and it makes me realize how incredibly small my world has been. Small how? I thought making partner at a mid-sized law firm was the pinnacle of success. I thought earning a few $100,000 a year made me wealthy. I thought being able to buy you a nice dinner or a piece of jewelry made me a good provider. He laughed, but there was no humor in it. Meanwhile, you were operating on a level one can't even comprehend. You weren't just wealthy, you were powerful. You weren't just successful, you were influential. You weren't just smart, you were brilliant. And how does that make you feel about our marriage? Marcus considered the question carefully. Like I've been playing house while you've been changing the world. Like I've been so focused on my own small achievements that I completely missed the fact that I was married to someone extraordinary. Is that a good thing or a bad thing? I don't know yet, he admitted. Part of me is proud. Proud to be married to someone so accomplished, so capable, so impactful. Part of me is ashamed that I was so blind, so self-absorbed, so dismissive of what you might be capable of. He paused, then added quietly, and part of me is wondering whether someone like you could ever really be happy with someone like me. It was a fair question, and one I'd been asking myself as well. The Marcus I'd married was charming and ambitious and attractive, but he was also limited in ways I was only now beginning to fully understand. His world was small, his perspective narrow, his understanding of power and influence confined to the relatively minor realm of his law firm. Could a marriage work between two people operating on such different levels? Could love survive such a fundamental imbalance in capability and achievement? I don't know either, I said honestly. But I think we owe it to ourselves to find out. The real test came the following week, when Marcus had to face his colleagues at Henderson & Associates with the knowledge that his wife now owned the firm where he worked. I'd given him the choice of how to handle the situation, whether to reveal my ownership immediately or to keep it private while he adjusted to the new reality. He chose transparency, a decision that surprised me with its courage. I want to tell them, he said over breakfast on Monday morning. I want to face this head-on rather than living with the secret. Besides, they'll find out eventually anyway, and I'd rather it come from me. I admired his decision, even as I worried about the consequences. The legal profession was notoriously conservative and hierarchical, and Marcus's reputation would inevitably suffer from the revelation that his wife was now his boss. But he was determined to handle it with dignity, and I respected him for that. The staff meeting was scheduled for 10 o'clock that morning. I arrived at 9:30, entering through the back entrance and settling into the conference room that was now technically mine. Marcus arrived a few minutes later, looking pale but resolute. The other partners and senior associates filed in gradually, chatting among themselves about cases and clients, completely unaware that their world was about to shift dramatically. Marcus stood at the head of the conference table, his hands steady despite what I knew must be significant nerves. Before we begin the regular meeting, he said, his voice carrying clearly through the room, I have an announcement to make. As you all know, the firm recently accepted a significant investment from a private equity group to address our cash flow challenges. What you don't know is the identity of our new majority shareholder. The room fell silent, all eyes focused on Marcus. I could see the curiosity and concern on the faces around the table. The partners who'd worked with him for years wondering what bombshell he was about to drop. Our new majority shareholder, Marcus continued, is my wife, Helen Williams. She purchased controlling interest in Henderson and Associates through one of her investment companies, and as of last week, she effectively owns the firm. The silence that followed was deafening. I watched the faces around the table process this information, saw the confusion and disbelief and, in some cases, horror, as they realized what Marcus was telling them. Their colleague's wife, the woman they'd met at firm parties and charity events, the one they'd assumed was a typical lawyer's spouse, was now their boss. James Henderson, the founding partner whose family name was on the firm's letterhead, was the first to find his voice. Marcus, are you telling us that your wife is the anonymous investor who saved the firm from bankruptcy? That's exactly what I'm telling you. Marcus's voice remained steady, though I could see the tension in his shoulders. Helen has been a successful entrepreneur and investor for over a decade. The investment in our firm represents a small portion of her overall portfolio. But she's... Linda Morrison, one of the senior partners, started to speak and then stopped, clearly struggling to process the revelation. We thought she was a housewife. You thought what you wanted to think, Marcus replied calmly. Helen never claimed to be unemployed or financially dependent. You made assumptions based on your own biases about what lawyers' wives are supposed to be like. Richard Blackwell, another senior partner, leaned forward in his chair. Marcus, are you seriously telling us that while we've been struggling to keep this firm afloat, your wife could have helped us at any time? Helen was under no obligation to help us, Marcus said firmly. She's not a lawyer, she's not part of this firm's legacy, and she had no reason to involve herself in our business problems. The fact that she chose to invest when we needed it most was an act of generosity, not obligation. Generosity? James Henderson's voice was rising. Marcus, she now owns the firm. That's not generosity, that's acquisition. I decided it was time to speak for myself. Standing up from my seat at the back of the room, I walked to the front of the conference table, noting how every head turned to follow my movement. Gentlemen, ladies, I said, my voice calm and professional. I understand that this situation is unusual, and I appreciate your concerns about the firm's future under new ownership. Linda Morrison stared at me as if I were an alien species. Mrs. Chen, we had no idea that you were involved in business. We always assumed that I was decorative, I finished for her. Yes, I'm aware of what you assumed. And I'm sure you're wondering what my ownership of this firm means for your careers and your autonomy. Richard Blackwell crossed his arms defensively. Well, yes. Are you planning to interfere with how we practice law? Are you going to start making decisions about cases and clients and personnel? I'm planning to ensure that this firm remains profitable and competitive, I replied smoothly. I'm not a lawyer, so I have no intention of involving myself in legal strategy or case management. However, I am a businesswoman, and I will be taking an active interest in the firm's financial performance, client acquisition, and strategic growth. James Henderson looked skeptical. With all due respect, Mrs. Chen, running a law firm is very different from whatever other businesses you've been involved in. We have ethical obligations, professional standards, regulatory requirements that you might not understand. I smiled at him, the expression polite but unmistakably condescending. Mr. Henderson, my current portfolio includes ownership stakes in 3 other professional services firms, including a major accounting practice and a consulting company that works exclusively with Fortune 500 clients. I'm quite familiar with the regulatory environment in which knowledge-based businesses operate. The room fell silent again as the partners absorbed this information. I could see them recalculating their understanding of who I was and what my involvement might mean for their comfortable, predictable world. Furthermore, I continued, I've already retained a team of consultants to conduct a comprehensive review of the firm's operations. They'll be analyzing everything from billing practices to client satisfaction to staff utilization rates. I expect to receive their preliminary report within 2 weeks. Marcus was watching me with an expression I couldn't quite read. Pride, maybe, mixed with something that might have been awe. He'd never seen me in full business mode before, and I could tell he was beginning to understand the scope of what he'd missed during our marriage. "What kind of changes are you expecting to implement?" Linda Morrison asked, her voice tight with barely concealed anxiety. "That depends on what the analysis reveals," I replied. "But I can tell you that I'm particularly interested in expanding the firm's corporate practice, developing new revenue streams, and improving operational efficiency. I'm also considering opening satellite offices in key markets and potentially acquiring smaller boutique firms to expand our service offerings." Richard Blackwell looked like he was about to have a heart attack. "Mrs. Chen, this firm has operated successfully for over 30 years. We have established relationships, proven systems, a reputation for excellence that we've built over decades. And you also have declining profitability, increasing overhead costs, and a client base that's aging out of the market," I countered smoothly. "Your established systems may have worked in the past, but they're not sustainable in the current business environment. That's why you needed outside investment in the first place." The truth of my statement hung in the air like a challenge. The partners couldn't deny that the firm had been struggling financially, couldn't argue with the fact that they'd needed my money to avoid bankruptcy, but they also couldn't quite accept that their new majority shareholder was someone they'd dismissed as a trophy wife. "I think," I said, my voice taking on a more authoritative tone, "that we need to establish some ground rules for how this is going to work going forward. First, I expect complete transparency about the firm's operations. I want weekly financial reports, monthly client reviews, and quarterly strategic planning sessions. Second, all major decisions regarding new hires, significant expenditures, or strategic initiatives will require my approval. Third, I'll be installing a new chief operating officer to oversee day-to-day business operations, freeing you up to focus on legal practice." James Henderson's face was turning red. "Mrs. Chen, with all due respect, that level of oversight is completely inappropriate. We're professionals, not employees to be micromanaged." "You're employees now," I said simply. "You're my employees. And like any responsible business owner, I'm going to ensure that my investment is properly managed and that my employees are performing to expectations." The room erupted in protests and objections, with several partners talking at once about professional autonomy and traditional law firm culture. I let them vent for a few minutes, then raised my hand for silence. "Gentlemen, ladies," I said when the room quieted down, "I understand that this transition will be difficult. Change always is. But I want to be very clear about something. You have a choice. You can embrace the new reality and work with me to build a more successful, more profitable, more competitive firm. Or you can resist the changes and find yourselves looking for new employment opportunities." The threat was delivered with a smile, but it was unmistakably a threat. Around the table, I could see the partners exchanging glances, calculating their options, weighing their desire for independence against their need for financial security. Marcus finally spoke up, his voice cutting through the tension. "I think what Helen is proposing makes sense from a business perspective. We've been operating the same way for decades, and it's led us to the brink of financial ruin. Maybe it's time to try something different." Several of his colleagues turned to stare at him with expressions of betrayal and disbelief. Richard Blackwell's voice was sharp with accusation. "Easy for you to say, Marcus. Your wife owns the firm now. Your job security is guaranteed." "Actually," I interjected smoothly, "Marcus's job security is no more guaranteed than anyone else's. In fact, it might be less secure given the potential appearance of nepotism. I'll be holding him to the same performance standards as everyone else, possibly higher standards to avoid any suggestion of favoritism." Marcus nodded in agreement, though I could see the cost of that public declaration in his tense expression. "Helen's right. I don't expect any special treatment, and I wouldn't want it. I'll succeed or fail on my own merits, just like everyone else." James Henderson stood up abruptly, his face flushed with anger and humiliation. "This is intolerable. I founded this firm 30 years ago. I built it from nothing into one of the most respected practices in the city. I will not be treated like a junior associate by someone who thinks she can buy her way into the legal profession." "Mr. Henderson," I said calmly, "you're absolutely right. You did build this firm into something successful and respected. But you also allowed it to stagnate and decline to the point where you needed my money to survive. You can either work with me to restore it to profitability and growth, or you can exercise the buyout clause in your partnership agreement and retire with dignity. The choice is yours. Henderson stared at me for a long moment, his jaw working as if he were chewing on words too bitter to swallow. Finally, he turned and walked out of the conference room without another word. The door slammed behind him with enough force to rattle the framed diplomas on the walls. The remaining partners sat in stunned silence, processing what they'd just witnessed. Their founding partner, the man whose name was on the letterhead, had just been effectively dismissed by a woman they'd thought was nothing more than a lawyer's wife. Anyone else have concerns they'd like to voice? I asked pleasantly. No one spoke. The message had been delivered and received. The old Henderson and Associates was dead, and something new was being born in its place. Something that I would control completely. Excellent, I said, gathering my papers. I'll expect those weekly reports starting this Friday. And I'd like to schedule individual meetings with each of you over the next 2 weeks to discuss your roles in the firm's future. Marcus will coordinate the scheduling. As I walked toward the door, I paused and turned back to address the room one final time. Oh, and one more thing. I'll be moving into Mr. Henderson's corner office, assuming he decides to take the buyout. I'll need somewhere to work when I'm on site, and it seems like the most appropriate space. The symbolism wasn't lost on anyone. I was literally taking over the seat of power, claiming the physical space that had represented authority and prestige for 3 decades. The partners watched me leave with expressions ranging from shock to resentment to grudging respect. Marcus caught up with me in the parking lot, his face a mixture of admiration and concern. Helen, that was intense. Are you sure you want to be that aggressive with them? These are people I have to work with every day. Marcus, I said, unlocking my Bentley, these are people who work for me now. The sooner they understand that dynamic, the easier this transition will be for everyone involved. But Henderson was a founding partner. He's been practicing law since before either of us was born. Don't you think you were a little harsh with him? I paused with my hand on the car door, considering how to explain what Marcus still didn't fully understand. Darling, James Henderson was bleeding this firm dry with his outdated practices and his refusal to adapt to changing market conditions. His departure isn't a loss, it's an opportunity. Now I can bring in someone with fresh ideas and modern management techniques. Marcus looked troubled. It just feels wrong somehow. Like we're destroying something that took decades to build. We're not destroying anything, I replied firmly. We're saving it. And if some people can't adapt to the new reality, that's their choice. But I won't allow nostalgia or misplaced loyalty to stand in the way of success. As I drove away from the firm that was now mine, I reflected on how dramatically the balance of power had shifted in just 1 week. 7 days ago, Marcus had called me worthless and assumed he held all the cards in our relationship. Now he was defending me to his colleagues while grappling with the reality that I held not just the cards but the entire deck. The question was whether our marriage could survive such a complete reversal of everything he'd believed about our respective roles, and whether I even wanted it to. The weeks following the firm takeover brought a series of revelations that continued to reshape Marcus's understanding of our marriage and his place in the world. Each morning brought new evidence of just how thoroughly I had been managing our life together without his knowledge or participation. The discovery that I owned Henderson and Associates was just the beginning. It started with small things. Marcus began noticing that service providers around our home addressed me with a level of deference that went beyond mere politeness. The landscaping crew that maintained our extensive gardens didn't just work for us. They worked for Williams Estate Services, a company I had established to manage the properties of ultra-high net worth individuals. Our house was essentially their showcase property, demonstrating their capabilities to potential clients who paid millions annually for similar services. The personal chef who prepared our meals 3 times a week wasn't just someone I had hired through an agency. She was the head chef at Luminous, the Michelin-starred restaurant I had quietly opened downtown 2 years earlier. Her appearances at our home were part training exercise, part personal favor to me as the restaurant's owner. The meals Marcus had enjoyed and complimented, thinking I had simply found an excellent private chef, were actually test runs for dishes that would later appear on the menu of one of the city's most exclusive dining establishments. Even our housekeeper, Maria, whom Marcus had always treated with casual friendliness, revealed depths of connection to my business empire that left him speechless. During a conversation about scheduling, she mentioned that her daughter Sophia was starting her sophomore year at Stanford on a full scholarship from the Williams Foundation. Her son Carlos was completing his medical residency at Johns Hopkins, also funded by my educational initiatives. Maria wasn't just our housekeeper. She was part of an extended network of people whose lives I had touched through my philanthropic work. "How many people are there?" Marcus asked one evening as we sat in our living room, the space feeling somehow different now that he understood the true value of everything in it. "How many people do you support, employ, or help in ways I never knew about?" I looked up from my tablet, where I had been reviewing quarterly reports from my various ventures. "Directly? Probably around 3,000 people between all my companies. Indirectly, through the startups I fund and the initiatives I support, it's closer to 15,000, maybe 20. Marcus set down his wine glass with a slightly shaky hand. 20,000 people depend on you for their livelihoods. Depend is a strong word, but yes, my business decisions affect that many lives, possibly more. It's a responsibility I take very seriously. And you never mentioned this because you never asked what I did with my time, and I wasn't sure you'd be comfortable knowing that your wife had that kind of influence." I paused, studying his face. "I wasn't sure you'd be comfortable being married to someone more powerful than you." The honesty of my statement hung between us like a challenge. Marcus had always prided himself on being the successful one in our relationship, the partner with the important career and the impressive income. Learning that I operated on a scale he had never even imagined was forcing him to confront some uncomfortable truths about his own ego and assumptions. "You were protecting my feelings again," he said, but there was no gratitude in his voice. "Letting me believe I was the important one while you quietly ran an empire." "I was protecting our marriage. There's a difference." "Is there?" "Because it seems to me like you were just postponing this conversation, not avoiding it entirely. Eventually, I was going to find out who you really are." I closed my tablet and gave him my full attention. "You're right. I was postponing it. I kept thinking that maybe if I revealed things gradually, if I let you grow into understanding my world bit by bit, it would be easier for both of us. But I underestimated how thoroughly you had committed to your version of our story." Marcus stood up and walked to the window that overlooked our circular driveway, where the Shelby Cobra sat gleaming under the security lights like a beautiful rebuke to everything he had thought he knew about our finances. "Your version of our story is that I'm a small-minded man who married a trophy wife because I was too insecure to handle being with an equal. My version of our story is that you're a good man who fell in love with an image instead of a person, and I enabled that because it was easier than risking rejection." He turned to face me, his expression a mixture of hurt and frustration. "So we're both cowards then. You were afraid to be yourself, and I was afraid to look beyond the surface. We were both protecting ourselves in the ways we knew how. The question now is whether we want to build something real together, or whether we want to keep living in the fantasy we created." Before Marcus could respond, my phone rang with the distinctive tone I had assigned to urgent business calls. The caller ID showed Rebecca Martinez, the CEO of the tech startup that had gone public the previous month, with a valuation that had surprised even my most optimistic projections. "I need to take this," I told Marcus, accepting the call. "Rebecca, what's happening?" "Helen, we have a situation. Goldman Sachs is trying to poach 3 of our key engineers with offers that are frankly insulting to our intelligence. But they're also making noise about questioning our IP protections in some very public forums. I think they're trying to drive down our stock price so they can make an acquisition play." I felt the familiar surge of adrenaline that came with corporate warfare. "Do we have documentation of the recruitment attempts? Any evidence that they're coordinating the IP attacks with the poaching efforts?" "Our legal team is working on it, but I wanted to get your read on how aggressive we should be in responding. This could get very public very quickly." Marcus was watching me with fascination as I shifted into what he was beginning to recognize as my business persona. The woman who had been discussing the state of our marriage moments earlier was gone, replaced by someone who spoke in precise strategic terms about market manipulation and competitive threats. Set up a call with our media relations firm for first thing tomorrow morning, I instructed Rebecca. I want them to prepare a comprehensive response strategy that positions Goldman's behavior as predatory and anti-competitive. And get me a meeting with our board of directors for this week. If Goldman wants to play hardball, we'll show them what a real fight looks like. Got it. Do you want me to loop in the legal team from Williams Holdings? Absolutely. And Rebecca? Make sure our engineers know that if they're tempted by Goldman's offers, we're prepared to make counteroffers that will make their heads spin. We don't lose talent to bullies. I ended the call and found Marcus staring at me with an expression I had never seen before. Not the polite attention he gave me when I talked about my day. Not the indulgent smile he wore when he thought I was discussing something trivial. This was genuine respect mixed with something that might have been intimidation. Williams Holdings? He asked quietly. My holding company. It owns controlling interests in about 40 different businesses across various sectors. I picked up my tablet and pulled up an organizational chart that looked like a family tree designed by someone with delusions of grandeur. Technology, real estate, hospitality, renewable energy, financial services, entertainment. I've been diversifying for years to minimize risk and maximize growth opportunities. Marcus studied the chart, his eyes widening as he recognized company names he had read about in business publications. You own TechFlow Solutions, the company that developed the new AI-driven logistics platform? 60% stake. I led their Series A funding round 3 years ago, when they were just 5 people working out of a garage. Now they have contracts with Amazon, FedEx, and UPS. And Meridian Properties? The real estate development firm that's building that new mixed-use complex downtown? 75%. I identified the opportunity when the city announced their urban renewal initiative and moved quickly to secure the land rights before other developers caught on. Marcus sat down heavily, the organizational chart still displayed on my tablet screen. Helen, these are companies I read about in Forbes. These are businesses that employ thousands of people and generate hundreds of millions in revenue. You're not just wealthy, you're a major economic force. I'm a successful entrepreneur who's been very good at identifying opportunities and capitalizing on them. The scale is a natural result of compounding returns over time. The scale is terrifying, Marcus said bluntly. I'm sitting here looking at this chart, and I'm realizing that your smallest subsidiary probably generates more revenue than my entire law firm. Even after you bought it. I could see him struggling with the implications, trying to reconcile the woman he had married with the business empire displayed on my screen. The cognitive dissonance was written all over his face, the difficulty of accepting that his assumptions had been so fundamentally wrong. Does it change how you feel about me? I asked quietly. Knowing that I'm not the person you thought you married? Marcus was quiet for a long time, considering the question seriously. I don't know, he said finally. Part of me is amazed, proud even. I'm married to someone extraordinary, someone who's accomplished things I never even dreamed of. But part of me is also intimidated? Irrelevant, he corrected. Like I'm a minor character in your story, instead of a partner in our story. Like everything I've achieved, everything I'm proud of, is just background noise compared to what you've built. It was an honest answer, and I appreciated it, even as it confirmed my worst fears about how he would handle the truth. So what do we do with that feeling? I don't know that either, but I think I need to understand more about who you really are, before I can figure out whether we have a future together. Over the following days, I began sharing more details of my business life with Marcus, letting him see behind the curtain of the empire I had built, while he thought I was planning dinner parties and getting manicures. I took him to board meetings where I was the only woman in rooms full of powerful men who hung on my every word. I let him sit in on conference calls where I negotiated deals worth more money than most people would see in a lifetime. I showed him the command center I had built in our basement, a sophisticated setup with multiple screens and secure communication lines that allowed me to monitor my various enterprises in real time. This is what you were doing when you said you were reorganizing the wine cellar, Marcus observed, watching me review real-time performance data from 12 different companies simultaneously. The wine cellar is organized. It's also surveilled and climate-controlled, and contains bottles worth more than most people's cars. But yes, sometimes I come down here to work, when I need absolute focus and zero interruptions. Marcus examined the setup with the eye of someone who was beginning to understand the scope of what he had missed. How long have you been building all this? Seriously? About 15 years. I started my first company when I was 22, sold it for $8 million 2 years later, and used that as seed capital for bigger ventures. Each success funded the next opportunity. Each acquisition opened doors to new markets. And your family money gave me the freedom to take risks without worrying about failure. When you don't need to worry about rent or food, you can afford to invest in long-term projects that might not pay off for years. I pulled up a historical chart showing the growth of my net worth over time. The family money was important for getting started, but everything after the first few years has been the result of my own work. Marcus studied the chart with the intensity of someone trying to solve a complex puzzle. The exponential growth really took off about 5 years ago. That's when I started focusing on emerging technologies and international markets. AI, renewable energy, biotechnology, cryptocurrency. I identified trends before they became mainstream and positioned myself to capitalize on them. While I was working 16-hour days to make partner at a law firm, you were building expertise and establishing yourself in your chosen profession. There's nothing wrong with that path. Except that it put me so far behind you that we're not even playing the same game anymore. I turned away from the screens to face him fully. Marcus, this isn't a competition. We don't have to be playing the same game for our marriage to work. Don't we? He gestured at the wall of monitors displaying real-time data from around the world. How do I compete with this? How do I be a partner to someone who operates on this level? What do I bring to this relationship that you couldn't get from someone more successful, more accomplished, more what? More worthy of someone like you. The words hung in the air between us, heavy with the weight of his insecurity and self-doubt. I could see him struggling with feelings of inadequacy that my revelations had triggered, trying to reconcile his sense of himself as a successful man with the reality of being married to someone whose achievements dwarfed his own. Marcus, I said gently, I didn't marry you because of your net worth or your business accomplishments. I married you because you made me laugh, because you were kind to waiters and cab drivers, because you remembered my coffee order and brought me flowers for no reason. I married you because you saw me as a person worth caring about, not as a business asset or a networking opportunity. But that person you're talking about, the one who made you laugh and brought you flowers, that was someone who thought he was your equal. Someone who believed he was taking care of you, providing for you, being the strong one in the relationship. Now I find out that you were the one taking care of everything all along. Does that change who you are? Does knowing that I'm wealthy make you less kind, less funny, less capable of love? Marcus considered the question seriously. No, but it changes everything about our dynamic. It makes me question whether anything about our relationship was real, or whether you were just playing along with my delusions because it was easier than telling the truth. It was a fair criticism, and one I had been expecting. Some of it was performance, I admitted. The grateful wife accepting gifts she didn't need, the supportive spouse whose own ambitions were secondary to yours. But the love was real, Marcus. The attraction, the companionship, the partnership we built within the constraints we created, that was all genuine. But it was built on a lie. It was built on incomplete information. There's a difference. Marcus shook his head, frustration evident in his voice. How can you be so calm about this? How can you act like it's no big deal that our entire marriage has been based on fundamental misunderstandings about who we are? Because I've had 3 years to think about this moment. 3 years to imagine how you'd react when you learned the truth. 3 years to prepare for the possibility that knowing who I really am might end our marriage. The admission seemed to hit Marcus like a physical blow. You've been planning for our divorce since we got married? I've been hoping I was wrong about how you'd react, but preparing for the possibility that I was right. It's what successful people do, Marcus. We plan for multiple scenarios and prepare for various outcomes. Even the end of their marriages? Especially the end of their marriages. The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of my assistant Caroline, who had been with me for over a decade and knew more about my business operations than most CEOs knew about their own companies. She descended the stairs to my command center with the brisk efficiency of someone accustomed to delivering urgent information. "Helen, I'm sorry to interrupt, but we have a situation with the Singapore acquisition. The regulatory approval process has hit a snag, and David Chen is requesting an immediate conference call to discuss our options." Marcus's head snapped up at the mention of Singapore and David Chen. "Wait, are you talking about the Chen Industries merger? The one that's been all over the financial news for the past month?" Caroline glanced at Marcus with polite uncertainty, clearly unsure how much information she should share in front of him. I nodded to indicate that he was cleared to hear the details. "Mrs. Williams is leading the acquisition of Chen Industries' Southeast Asian operations," Caroline explained. "It's a $3.7 billion deal that will make Williams Holdings one of the largest Western investors in the region's emerging technology sector." Marcus stared at me with something approaching awe. $3.7 billion. "It's been in the works for 18 months, I said, pulling up the relevant files on one of my screens. "David Chen is retiring and wants to ensure his companies have the capital and expertise to compete globally. The merger will give us access to markets we've never been able to penetrate effectively." "And you're personally negotiating this deal?" "I'm leading the negotiating team, yes. Caroline, set up the call for 20 minutes from now. I want our legal team from Hong Kong on the line, as well as the regulatory specialists from our Singapore office." As Caroline headed back upstairs to coordinate the call, Marcus remained frozen in his chair, staring at the screens that displayed information about a deal worth more money than some countries' GDP. "You're personally involved in a transaction that's larger than the annual budget of most states," he said slowly. "It's not the largest deal I've ever done, but it's certainly one of the most complex. International acquisitions always involve multiple regulatory frameworks and cultural considerations that can complicate negotiations. Helen, I read about this merger in the Wall Street Journal. They called it one of the most significant cross-border technology deals of the decade. And you're the person making it happen. I'm one of the people making it happen. This kind of transaction requires teams of specialists in law, finance, technology, and international relations. I coordinate the strategy, but the execution involves dozens of experts." Marcus stood up and walked to one of the screens displaying the organizational structure of Chen Industries, studying the complex web of subsidiaries and partnerships that would soon be under my control. "If this deal goes through, how many additional employees will you be responsible for?" "Approximately 12,000, spread across 6 countries. Plus the indirect employment effects in their supplier networks and customer bases. Probably closer to 25,000 people whose jobs will be influenced by our decisions." 25,000, Marcus repeated, his voice barely above a whisper. "Helen, you're talking about having economic influence over entire regions. You're not just a successful businesswoman, you're a major power broker." "I'm someone who's been very good at identifying opportunities and assembling the resources needed to capitalize on them. The scale is just a natural result of compound growth over time. The scale is unprecedented, at least in my experience." Marcus turned to face me, his expression a mixture of admiration and something that might have been fear. "I'm beginning to understand why you thought I might not be comfortable knowing who you really are." "And are you? Comfortable, I mean." Marcus was quiet for a long moment, considering the question with the seriousness it deserved. "I'm terrified," he said finally. "Terrified of being married to someone so much more successful than me. Terrified that I'll never be able to contribute anything meaningful to your life. Terrified that you'll eventually realize you could do better than a small-town lawyer who thought making partner was the pinnacle of achievement. But are you planning to run away from that terror or work through it?" "I don't know yet. But I think I owe it to both of us to try to work through it." The conference call with Singapore took 3 hours and required me to negotiate in 2 languages while managing the competing interests of regulatory agencies, investment banks, and government officials. Marcus sat quietly in the corner of my command center, watching me orchestrate a deal that would reshape the economic landscape of Southeast Asia. I could see him taking notes, trying to understand the complexity of what was happening, asking occasional questions during breaks in the negotiation. When the call finally ended with a preliminary agreement to move forward, Marcus looked at me with an expression I had never seen before. Not the indulgent smile he used when he thought I was discussing something trivial, not the polite attention he gave to conversations he didn't fully understand. This was genuine respect, mixed with what I was beginning to recognize as healthy fear. "That was incredible," he said quietly. "I've seen you negotiate before, obviously. Dinner reservations, home repairs, social commitments. But this was completely different. You were commanding a room full of people who control billions of dollars in assets, speaking with authority about markets and regulations, and cultural factors I've never even heard of. It's what I do, Marcus. It's who I am when I'm allowed to be myself instead of playing the role of the supportive wife. The woman I just watched negotiate that deal, she's not someone who needs anyone's protection or support. She's someone who provides protection and support to thousands of other people. Does that change how you feel about being married to me?" Marcus considered the question carefully, and I could see him struggling with the implications of everything he had learned. "It makes me question whether I have anything to offer someone like you. It makes me wonder whether you stayed in this marriage out of love or out of pity." "It was love, Marcus. Complicated, incomplete, sometimes frustrating love, but genuine nonetheless. Even though I never really knew you, especially because you never really knew me. You loved me without knowing how successful I was, how wealthy, how powerful. You loved me for reasons that had nothing to do with my achievements or my bank account. Do you know how rare that is for someone in my position?" Marcus was quiet for a moment, processing the implications of what I was saying. "So you stayed with me because I was too clueless to be impressed by your money?" "I stayed with you because you made me feel normal. Because with you, I could pretend to be just a woman in love with her husband, instead of a CEO managing multiple crises while trying to maintain a personal life." "But that wasn't real either, was it? The normal woman you pretended to be?" "Parts of it were real. The parts that involved caring about you, enjoying your company, building a life together. The parts that were fake were the limitations I imposed on myself to maintain the illusion. So who are you really? The woman who negotiates billion-dollar deals, or the woman who pretends to need her husband's protection?" I smiled at him, but there was sadness in it. "I'm both, Marcus. I'm the woman who can reshape international markets and the woman who wants someone to bring her coffee in the morning and ask about her day. I'm the person who employs thousands of people and the person who just wants to watch movies on the couch with someone who loves her. The complexity is what makes me human. And you think I can handle that complexity? I think you're going to have to decide whether you want to try. Because I can't go back to pretending to be less than I am. I can't spend the rest of my life hiding my achievements and minimizing my capabilities to protect your ego." Marcus nodded slowly, understanding the choice I was laying out for him. "So I either accept all of who you are, or we end this marriage. That's exactly what I'm saying. And if I choose to try to accept it, what does that look like? How do we rebuild our relationship on a foundation of honesty instead of illusion? We start by acknowledging that we're not the people we thought we were when we got married. We figure out who we actually are, separately and together. We decide whether the people we really are can love each other in a sustainable way. That sounds terrifying. It is terrifying. But it's also the only path forward that doesn't involve one of us sacrificing fundamental parts of themselves for the other's comfort." Marcus stood up and walked to the wall of screens that displayed real-time information about my various business interests. Companies I owned, deals I was negotiating, investments I was monitoring, all of it representing a level of success and influence he was still struggling to comprehend. "If we do this," he said, his back still turned to me, "if we try to rebuild our marriage on honest foundations, I need to know that you're committed to making it work. I need to know that you're not just going through the motions while you wait for me to fail. And I need to know that you're not going to spend the rest of our marriage resenting me for being more successful than you expected. I need to know that you can be proud of what I've accomplished instead of threatened by it." Marcus turned around to face me, his expression more serious than I had ever seen it. "I want to try, Helen. I want to see if we can make this work, but I'm going to need time to adjust to this new reality. And I'm going to need patience while I figure out how to be married to someone who operates on your level. And I'm going to need space to plant, be myself, without constantly worrying about how my success affects your sense of masculinity. I'm going to need a partner who supports my ambitions instead of one who needs me to downplay them. So we're both going to have to change. We're both going to have to grow into the people we actually are, instead of the people we thought we were supposed to be. Marcus extended his hand to me, a gesture that felt both familiar and completely new given everything that had changed between us. Partners? I took his hand, feeling the weight of everything we were committing to try to build together. Partners. But even as we shook hands on our commitment to honesty and growth, I could see the doubt in Marcus's eyes, the fear that he might not be strong enough to handle being married to someone like me. And I wondered whether love would be enough to overcome the fundamental imbalance in our capabilities and achievements, or whether some gaps were simply too wide to bridge. The first real test of our newfound commitment to honesty came 3 weeks later, when Marcus's mother announced she was coming to visit. Eleanor Chen had never particularly liked me, though she had been polite enough during our courtship and wedding. In her mind, I was an acceptable choice for her successful son, attractive and well-mannered enough to enhance his social standing without being so accomplished as to overshadow him. She had often made comments about how lucky I was to have found such a dedicated provider, how fortunate I was that Marcus was willing to support me in the lifestyle I had grown accustomed to. The irony of those comments had always amused me privately, but I had never corrected her assumptions. Like her son, Eleanor needed to believe that Marcus was the successful one in our relationship, that he was the provider and protector, while I was the grateful beneficiary of his generosity. It reinforced her sense of having raised a son worthy of pride and admiration. Now, with the truth about my financial situation becoming impossible to hide, Marcus was faced with a dilemma. He could continue to perpetuate the fiction that he was supporting me, or he could tell his mother that her understanding of our marriage had been completely wrong from the beginning. Neither option was particularly appealing to him. "She's going to ask questions," Marcus said as we sat in our kitchen the morning before Eleanor's arrival. "She always asks about the house, the cars, our investments. She likes to give financial advice and talk about retirement planning. I don't know how to handle those conversations now." I looked up from my tablet, where I had been reviewing the quarterly reports from my renewable energy portfolio. You could tell her the truth. The truth would destroy her understanding of everything she thinks she knows about me. She's proud of what she believes I've accomplished. Finding out that it was all financed by my wife would be devastating to her. "So you want to keep lying to protect her feelings?" Marcus's jaw tightened. "I want to find a way to handle this that doesn't humiliate either of us. There has to be some middle ground between complete deception and crushing revelation." I set down my tablet and studied his face, seeing the genuine distress there. Eleanor's opinion mattered to Marcus in ways that went beyond simple filial affection. She was a single mother who had worked multiple jobs to put him through law school, sacrificing her own comfort and opportunities to give him advantages she had never had. Her pride in his success was one of the driving forces in his life, and the prospect of disappointing her was clearly agonizing for him. "What if we told her that I've been doing some consulting work?" I suggested. "Nothing that would overshadow your achievements, but enough to explain why we can afford certain luxuries." Marcus looked hopeful for a moment, then shook his head. "She's too smart for that. She knows what lawyers make, and she knows what our lifestyle costs. Consulting work wouldn't begin to explain the Shelby Cobra or the house, renovations or the art collection. Then we tell her the truth gradually. We let her know that I've been more involved in business than she realized, without overwhelming her with the full scope of it. And when she asks what kind of business, when she wants details about where the money comes from," I smiled at him, recognizing the impossible position he was in. "Then you let me handle those questions. I've had practice explaining my success to people who don't expect women to be financially independent." Eleanor arrived Friday evening, her silver hair perfectly styled and her clothing impeccably chosen to project an image of understated elegance. She was a handsome woman in her 70s, with sharp eyes that missed very little, and a way of asking questions that seemed casual but were actually quite penetrating. Marcus picked her up from the airport in the Tesla, leaving the Cobra safely in the garage, where it wouldn't prompt immediate inquiries. Dinner that first night went smoothly enough. Eleanor complimented the meal, which had been prepared by our chef, and admired the table setting, which featured china and crystal she had always assumed Marcus had purchased. She asked about his work at the firm, and he was able to answer those questions honestly, describing recent cases and clients without having to navigate around uncomfortable truths. It was only when the conversation turned to our future plans that things became complicated. Eleanor had strong opinions about financial security and retirement planning, topics she had been discussing with Marcus since he started his career. She wanted to know about our investment strategies, our savings goals, our plans for building wealth over the long term. "You're at the point in your careers where you need to be thinking seriously about your financial future," she said over coffee and dessert. "Marcus, you're making excellent money now, but you can't practice law forever. You need to be putting away substantial amounts for retirement, investing in appreciating assets, building a portfolio that will support you both when you're older." Marcus glanced at me nervously, unsure how to respond without revealing information he wasn't ready to share. "We've been doing some investing," he said carefully. "Helen has actually been helping with that." Eleanor turned to me with polite interest. "Oh, do you have some experience with financial planning?" I could see Marcus holding his breath, waiting to see how I would handle the question. "I've done some work in investment management," I said, keeping my tone modest. "Nothing too sophisticated, but I've had some success with stock picks and market timing." "That's wonderful," Eleanor said approvingly. "It's so important for wives to understand financial matters, even if their husbands are the primary earners. Marcus, you're lucky to have a partner who takes an interest in your financial future." The assumption that Marcus was the primary earner hung in the air like a challenge. I could see him struggling with whether to correct his mother's misconception or let it stand. Finally, he chose a middle path that was technically honest, while still protecting the fiction Eleanor needed to believe. "Helen has actually been quite successful with her investments," he said. "More successful than either of us expected when she started." Eleanor's eyebrows rose slightly. "How successful?" "Successful enough that we've been able to make some significant purchases," Marcus replied, glancing at me for support. "The house renovations, some artwork. A few luxury items we wouldn't have been able to afford on my salary alone. Investment returns that substantial?" Eleanor looked skeptical. "What kind of investments are we talking about?" I could see that we were approaching the moment when partial truths would no longer be sufficient. Eleanor was too intelligent and too experienced to accept vague explanations about investment success without wanting specifics. The question was whether to retreat into comfortable lies or move forward into uncomfortable honesty. "I've been involved in some startup investments," I said, choosing my words carefully. "Technology companies mostly. Some of them have performed better than expected." "Startup investments?" Eleanor's tone sharpened with interest. "Those are quite risky, aren't they? How did you get involved in that kind of investing?" Marcus was watching our conversation with the intensity of someone observing a chess match, trying to anticipate moves and countermoves while hoping the board wouldn't explode entirely. "I have some background in technology," I explained. "I was able to identify opportunities that others might have missed." "What kind of background?" The questions were becoming more direct, and I could see that Eleanor wasn't going to be satisfied with evasive answers. She had the investigative instincts of someone who had spent decades making sure her son was making smart decisions, and she wasn't going to let claims about mysterious investment success go unexamined. "I studied business and technology in college," I said. "I've maintained connections in the industry that have given me access to investment opportunities. And these connections have been profitable enough to fund major home improvements." I glanced at Marcus, who was looking increasingly uncomfortable with the direction of the conversation. We had agreed to move toward honesty, but I could see him realizing that honesty with his mother would require revelations he wasn't prepared to make. "Some of the investments have done very well," I said simply. Eleanor studied me for a moment, her sharp eyes taking in details I suspected she had never noticed before. My watch, which was worth more than most people's cars. The necklace I was wearing, which was a custom piece from a designer whose waiting list stretched for months. The casual confidence with which I discussed financial matters that most people found intimidating. Helen, she said slowly, exactly how well have these investments done? The moment of truth had arrived, and I could see Marcus bracing himself for whatever was about to happen. I made a decision that would either bring us closer to the honest relationship we were trying to build, or destroy his relationship with his mother entirely. Well enough that I've been able to start my own investment fund, I said. I manage portfolios for a small group of high-net-worth clients, and I've been able to generate returns that have allowed us to live quite comfortably. It was a massive understatement, but it was technically true and less overwhelming than the full reality of my business empire. Eleanor absorbed this information with the careful attention of someone processing unexpected but potentially significant news. You manage other people's money? She asked. Among other things, yes. How much money are we talking about? Marcus cleared his throat nervously. Mom, maybe we should talk about something else. No, I want to understand this, Eleanor said firmly. Marcus, you've always been careful about money, responsible about planning for the future. If Helen is managing investments that are producing significant returns, I want to know the details. I could see that we had reached the point where partial revelations would be more damaging than complete honesty. Eleanor was too intelligent to accept vague explanations and too concerned about her son's welfare to let financial questions go unanswered. The fund manages approximately $200 million in assets, I said quietly. The silence that followed was profound. Eleanor stared at me as if I had just announced that I was from another planet. Marcus closed his eyes and took a deep breath, realizing that we had crossed the line from which there would be no retreat. $200 million, Eleanor repeated slowly. The fund has been quite successful. We've been able to generate returns that have exceeded most market benchmarks. Eleanor's gaze shifted between Marcus and me, her expression cycling through confusion, disbelief, and dawning understanding. Marcus, did you know about this? I've recently learned more about the scope of Helen's business activities, he said carefully. Recently learned? Eleanor's voice was rising slightly. What does that mean, exactly? Marcus and I exchanged glances, both realizing that we were about to have a conversation that would fundamentally alter Eleanor's understanding of our marriage and her son's life. It means that I've been more successful than Marcus initially realized, I said gently, and that our financial situation is more secure than either of you may have understood. Eleanor set down her coffee cup with a sharp click. Helen, are you telling me that you manage $200 million in investments while my son has been worrying about law firm finances and partnership prospects? The investment management is just one aspect of what I do, I replied. I'm also involved in several other business ventures. What kind of business ventures? I looked at Marcus, who nodded almost imperceptibly. We had committed to honesty, and there was no point in stopping now. I own several companies, I said simply. Technology firms, real estate developments, a restaurant, some manufacturing operations. The investment fund is actually one of my smaller enterprises. Eleanor stared at me in silence for what felt like an eternity. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. You own companies. 17 companies directly, with significant stakes in about 40 others. The portfolio has been built over the past 15 years, through a combination of acquisitions, startups, and strategic investments. 17 companies, Eleanor repeated, her voice hollow with shock. Marcus reached across the table to take his mother's hand. Mom, I know this is a lot to process. Eleanor pulled her hand away and turned to face her son directly. Marcus, what exactly have you been telling me about your life? About your marriage? About your financial situation? I've been telling you what I believe to be true, Marcus said defensively. I didn't know the full extent of Helen's business activities until recently. You didn't know that your wife owns 17 companies? Eleanor's voice was incredulous. How do you not know something like that about the person you're married to? It was a fair question, and one that Marcus had been grappling with for weeks. Helen kept her business life separate from our personal life. I thought she was just doing some casual investing, maybe managing a small portfolio for friends. Eleanor turned back to me, her expression a mixture of awe and accusation. "You let my son believe that he was supporting you while you were secretly running a business empire?" "I never claimed to need financial support," I said calmly. "Marcus made assumptions about our arrangement, and I chose not to correct them." "Why? Why would you hide something like this from your husband?" I had been dreading this question, because I knew that any honest answer would sound either manipulative or pitying. Because I wanted him to feel successful and important. Because I knew that his sense of self-worth was tied to being the provider in our relationship, and I didn't want to threaten that. Eleanor's eyes flashed with anger. "So you thought my son was too weak, too insecure to handle being married to a successful woman?" "I thought he was human," I replied. "And I thought that revealing the truth might damage our relationship in ways that couldn't be repaired." "But hiding the truth didn't damage your relationship?" "It's damaging it now," I admitted. Eleanor leaned back in her chair, her mind clearly racing as she tried to process the implications of everything she had learned. "Marcus, how do you feel about this? How do you feel about discovering that your wife has been patronizing you for years?" Marcus was quiet for a moment, considering how to answer a question that went to the heart of everything he had been struggling with. "I feel confused, grateful, angry, impressed, intimidated, sometimes all at the same time." "And you're planning to stay married to someone who thinks you're too fragile to handle the truth about her success?" "We're trying to figure out how to build a marriage based on honesty instead of assumptions," Marcus said. "It's not easy, but I think it's worth trying." Eleanor studied both of us with the careful attention of someone trying to solve a complex puzzle. "Helen, exactly how successful are you? What are we talking about in terms of your net worth?" I glanced at Marcus, who nodded again. We had come too far to retreat into partial truths now. "Approximately $60 million, I said quietly. Eleanor's face went pale. $60 million. Give or take a few million, depending on market conditions. You're worth $60 million, and you've been letting my son think he was supporting you? I've been letting your son feel proud of his achievements without overshadowing them with mine." Eleanor stood up abruptly and walked to the window that overlooked our garden, her back rigid with what I assumed was anger or shock. When she finally turned around, her expression was unreadable. "Marcus," she said quietly, "do you understand what this means?" "I'm beginning to," he replied. "This means that you're not the successful lawyer who married well. You're the lawyer who married a woman so far out of his league that it's almost comical." The words hung in the air like a slap. Marcus flinched visibly, and I felt a surge of protective anger on his behalf. "That's not fair, Eleanor," I said firmly. "Marcus's value as a person and as a husband has nothing to do with his net worth relative to mine." "Doesn't it?" Eleanor turned to face me directly. "You chose to hide your success because you thought it would threaten his masculinity. You thought he couldn't handle being married to someone more successful than him. What does that say about what you really think of my son?" It was a devastating question, one that struck at the heart of my own motivations and assumptions. Had I hidden my success out of love and consideration, or out of a fundamental lack of respect for Marcus's ability to grow and adapt? "I think your son is a good man who deserves to be loved for who he is, not judged by how much money he makes," I said. "But I also think that society conditions men to believe their worth is tied to their ability to provide, and I didn't want to put Marcus in a position where he felt inadequate or diminished." "So, you made the decision for him," Eleanor said accusingly. "You decided that he couldn't handle the truth, and you built your marriage on that assumption." "I made a choice that I thought would protect our relationship," I replied. "It may not have been the right choice, but it came from a place of love, not contempt." Eleanor returned to her seat, her expression thoughtful rather than angry. "Helen, I need you to understand something about my son. Marcus has spent his entire life working to prove that he was worthy of respect and success. He came from nothing, earned scholarships to good schools, built a career through pure determination and intelligence. The idea that he's been living off his wife's money, even unknowingly, will be devastating to his sense of himself." "I understand that," I said gently. "Which is why we're trying to find a way forward that honors both of our achievements and both of our contributions to this marriage." What kind of contributions can he possibly make to someone in your position? Eleanor asked bluntly. What can a small-town lawyer offer to a woman who owns companies and manages hundreds of millions of dollars? Marcus spoke up before I could answer. Mom, that's exactly the question I've been wrestling with. And Helen keeps telling me that marriage isn't about matching financial statements. Easy for her to say. She's the one with all the money. She's also the one who chose to marry me knowing that I would never be as successful as she is, Marcus pointed out. She could have married anyone, CEOs, politicians, other wealthy entrepreneurs. She chose me. Eleanor looked at me with new interest. Is that true? Did you know from the beginning that Marcus would never reach your level of success? It was another uncomfortable question, one that required me to examine my own motivations more closely than I had been willing to do before. I knew that Marcus was ambitious and intelligent, but that he was starting from a very different place than I was, I said carefully. I knew that my family background and early business success had given me advantages that he didn't have. But I also knew that he had qualities that money can't buy, such as integrity, kindness, the ability to see people as individuals rather than assets or obstacles, a sense of justice that made him want to use his legal skills to help people, not just to accumulate wealth. Eleanor considered this for a moment. Those are admirable qualities, but they don't pay for houses like this, or cars like the one in your driveway. No, they don't. But they make life worth living in houses like this and driving cars like that. That's a romantic notion, but it doesn't address the fundamental imbalance in your relationship. How do you have a partnership when one person brings $60 million and the other brings a lawyer's salary? I looked at Marcus, seeing him struggle with the same question that had been haunting him for weeks. We're still figuring that out, I admitted, but I think the first step is recognizing that financial contribution isn't the only way to add value to a marriage. What other ways are there? Emotional support, intellectual companionship, shared values and goals, the willingness to grow and change together, the commitment to building something together that's greater than what either person could achieve alone. Eleanor's expression softened slightly. Those things matter, certainly, but Helen, you have to understand that traditional gender roles exist for a reason. Men are conditioned to be providers, to feel responsible for their family's welfare. Finding out that his wife has been the real provider all along will challenge Marcus's most fundamental beliefs about himself and his role in this marriage. I know, I said simply. And we're working through that challenge together. Are you? Eleanor turned to Marcus. Son, are you really working through this? Or are you just trying to convince yourself that you can handle being married to someone so much more successful than you? Marcus was quiet for a long time, considering his mother's question with the seriousness it deserved. I don't know yet, he said finally. Some days I feel like I can grow into being Helen's equal partner in non-financial ways. Other days I feel like I'm fooling myself, like I'm trying to justify staying in a marriage that makes no sense from any practical perspective. And what about you, Helen? Eleanor asked. Are you really committed to making this work? Or are you just going through the motions until Marcus realizes he's outmatched? It was a brutal question, but a fair one. I'm committed to seeing whether the love we built on incomplete information can survive the transition to complete honesty. I think it can, but I'm not naive about the challenges. What happens if it can't? Then we'll end our marriage with respect and dignity, instead of living a lie that makes us both miserable. Eleanor nodded slowly, as if this answer satisfied her more than protestations of eternal love would have. At least you're being realistic about the difficulties. The conversation continued late into the evening, with Eleanor asking detailed questions about my business empire, and Marcus providing what explanations he could about our evolving relationship. By the time we went to bed, I felt emotionally drained but oddly hopeful. Eleanor's reaction had been challenging, but not catastrophic. She was struggling to understand our situation, but she wasn't rejecting it entirely. The next morning, I found Eleanor in the kitchen early, drinking coffee and reading financial news on her tablet. She looked up when I entered, her expression thoughtful rather than hostile. I've been thinking about our conversation last night, she said without preamble. And I have some questions that I couldn't ask in front of Marcus. I poured myself coffee and sat down across from her, preparing for another difficult conversation. I'm listening. Do you love my son, or do you just feel sorry for him? The question was direct and uncomfortable, cutting straight to fears I had been trying not to examine too closely. I love him. But I also recognize that pity has probably played a role in some of my decisions. Eleanor nodded approvingly. That's an honest answer. Do you think he loves you, or is he just intimidated by your success? Both, probably. Love and intimidation aren't mutually exclusive. No, they're not. But they're not sustainable as the primary basis for a marriage either. Eleanor sipped her coffee thoughtfully. Helen, I'm going to ask you something, and I want you to answer honestly. If you could go back and do it again, would you marry Marcus knowing what you know now, about how he'd react to learning about your success? I considered the question carefully, trying to imagine an alternate timeline where I had been honest from the beginning about my financial situation and business activities. I don't know, I said finally. If I had been honest from the start, we might never have gotten married at all. Marcus might have been too intimidated to pursue a relationship with someone in my position. And would that have been a bad thing? It would have meant missing out on 3 years of genuine love and companionship. It would have meant never discovering whether two people from very different worlds could build something meaningful together. Eleanor studied my face intently. But it also would have meant avoiding the crisis you're in now. True, but avoiding crisis isn't the same as finding happiness. Fair point. Eleanor was quiet for a moment. Helen, can I give you some advice? Of course. Don't try to fix this by making yourself smaller. Don't apologize for your success, or try to minimize your achievements to make Marcus feel better. If this marriage is going to work, it has to be because he grows into being worthy of you, not because you shrink into being someone he can handle. The advice surprised me with its wisdom and its generosity. I had expected Eleanor to be protective of her son's feelings, to encourage me to accommodate his insecurities rather than challenge him to overcome them. That's very generous of you, I said. It's not generous, it's practical. A marriage built on one person pretending to be less than they are is doomed to fail eventually. Better to find out now whether Marcus has the strength to rise to your level than to spend years watching him diminish you to his. And if he doesn't have that strength? Eleanor's expression was sad but resolute. Then you'll have learned something important about both of you, and you can both move on to relationships that don't require either person to be dishonest about who they are. It was a conversation that stayed with me for the rest of Eleanor's visit and long after she returned home. Her willingness to see our situation clearly, without the romantic delusions that often cloud discussions of marriage and love, had been both challenging and liberating. She had given me permission to be fully myself, while also acknowledging the real possibility that being fully myself might mean the end of my marriage. The question now was whether Marcus would rise to meet the challenge of being married to someone like me, or whether the gap between our capabilities and achievements was simply too wide to bridge. Either way, I was no longer willing to pretend to be less than I was to find out. The final test of our relationship came 6 months later, in the most unexpected way possible. Marcus had been making genuine efforts to adapt to our new dynamic, attending business events with me where he was introduced as my husband rather than the other way around, sitting in on conference calls where I made decisions that affected thousands of jobs, and slowly coming to terms with the reality that his wife operated in circles he had never imagined existed. But it was a phone call on a Tuesday evening that truly revealed whether we had built something sustainable or were simply delaying the inevitable. I was in my home office reviewing contracts for a potential acquisition when Marcus burst through the door, his face flushed with excitement and something that looked like panic. Helen, I need to talk to you. Right now. I looked up from the documents spread across my desk, taking in his agitated state. What's wrong? I just got off the phone with the Attorney General's office. They want me to lead the prosecution in the largest corporate fraud case in the state's history. We're talking about a multinational conspiracy involving billions of dollars in misappropriated funds, shell companies across 6 countries, and a network of corruption that reaches into some of the highest levels of government and business. I set down my pen, giving him my full attention. That's incredible, Marcus. That's the kind of case that defines careers. It is, but Helen, there's a problem. A big one. Marcus sat down heavily in the chair across from my desk. The primary defendant is Richardson Industries. And according to the preliminary investigation, Williams Holdings has significant business relationships with several of Richardson's subsidiaries. The implications hit me immediately. Richardson Industries was a massive conglomerate, with tentacles reaching into dozens of sectors, from defense contracting to pharmaceutical research to telecommunications infrastructure. If Marcus was prosecuting them for fraud, and my companies had business relationships with theirs, we would be on opposite sides of what could become the most high-profile legal battle of the decade. How significant are these business relationships? I asked, though I suspected I already knew the answer. Significant enough that you could be called as a witness, significant enough that some of your business decisions could become evidence in the case, significant enough that my career and your business empire could be in direct conflict. I pulled up my files on Richardson Industries and their various subsidiaries, scanning through years of contracts and partnership agreements. The relationships were indeed extensive. My renewable energy companies had licensing agreements with Richardson's technology division. My international holdings had joint ventures with their overseas operations. My investment fund had stakes in companies that had been acquired by Richardson's subsidiaries. This could get very complicated very quickly, I murmured, reviewing the tangled web of business connections. It's worse than complicated, Helen. The Attorney General specifically mentioned that they'd been investigating some of Williams Holdings' international dealings as part of their broader inquiry. They don't think you're involved in any wrongdoing, but they need to understand the nature of your business relationships to build their case. I felt a chill run down my spine. They've been investigating my companies? As part of the larger investigation, yes. And now they want me to lead the prosecution, which means I'll have access to all the evidence they've gathered, including evidence about your business activities. The ethical implications were staggering. Marcus would be in a position where he might have to make prosecutorial decisions that could affect my business interests. I might be called to testify in a case where my husband was the lead prosecutor. Our personal relationship could become a matter of public record in one of the most scrutinized legal proceedings in recent memory. What did you tell them? I asked. I told them I needed to discuss it with my wife before accepting the assignment. They gave me 24 hours to decide. We sat in silence for several minutes, both of us processing the magnitude of what was happening. This wasn't just about our marriage anymore. This was about careers, reputations, and potentially the largest legal case either of us would ever be involved in. Marcus, what do you want to do? I want to take the case. This is the opportunity I've been working toward my entire career. This is the kind of case that changes everything, that puts me on the map, as a serious prosecutor capable of handling the most complex, white-collar crimes. But I can't take it if it means destroying your business or compromising our marriage. I understood what he was really saying. This case represented everything he had been trying to prove about himself since learning the truth about my success. It was his chance to achieve something significant in his own right, to build a reputation that would stand independent of being married to me. It was his opportunity to become the kind of person who deserved to be my partner rather than my dependent. And if you don't take it, then someone else gets the biggest case of the decade, and I spend the rest of my career wondering what might have been. I go back to handling routine corporate disputes while other prosecutors make their names on the cases that matter. But if you do take it, Marcus looked directly at me, his expression serious, then we might end up on opposite sides of a legal battle that could destroy both our careers. You might have to choose between protecting your business interests and supporting my prosecution. I might have to make decisions that could cost you millions of dollars or damage relationships you've spent years building. It was the ultimate test of whether our marriage could survive the reality of who we actually were. Not the fantasy version where he was the successful provider and I was the grateful beneficiary, but the real version where we were both powerful people with potentially conflicting interests and ambitions. Helen, I need to know, If I take this case and if it puts us in opposition to each other, will you be able to live with that? Will you be able to support a decision that might hurt your business? I considered the question carefully, thinking through all the potential consequences. The Richardson case could indeed put my companies at risk. Depending on what evidence emerged, I might face regulatory scrutiny, partnership disputes, or financial losses that could run into the hundreds of millions. But I also understood what this opportunity meant to Marcus, and what refusing it would do to his sense of himself. Marcus, let me ask you something. If our positions were reversed, if I had to make a business decision that might negatively affect your career, would you want me to sacrifice my opportunity to protect you? He was quiet for a moment, considering the hypothetical. No, he said finally. I wouldn't want you to make yourself smaller to protect me from the consequences of my own choices. Then you have your answer. You're saying I should take the case? I'm saying you should make the decision that allows you to be the person you want to be, regardless of how it affects me. If you turn down this opportunity to protect my business interests, you'll resent me for it. And if I ask you to turn it down, I'll be doing exactly what you criticized me for doing during our marriage. I'll be making decisions for you based on what I think you can handle. Marcus stood up and walked to the window, staring out at the garden where we had shared so many conversations about our future. This could change everything between us. It could. But maybe that's not necessarily a bad thing. How can you say that? This could literally put us on opposite sides of a legal battle. It could also prove that we're both strong enough to pursue our own paths while still supporting each other. It could show that our marriage can survive us being equals instead of requiring one of us to be subordinate. Marcus turned back to face me, his expression a mixture of fear and determination. And if it doesn't? If this destroys us? Then we'll have learned something important about the limits of our compatibility. But Marcus, if we can't survive you achieving success that might conflict with my interests, then we were never going to have a real partnership anyway. You really mean that? I really mean that. Take the case, Marcus. Be the prosecutor you've always wanted to be. Let me worry about protecting my own business interests. Marcus walked back to my desk and took my hands in his. Helen, if I do this, there's a good chance our marriage will become public scrutiny. The media will investigate our relationship, our finances, our business dealings. They'll want to know how the prosecutor and the potential witness are married to each other. I know. They'll dig into your background, your companies, your net worth. Everything we've kept private will become public knowledge. I know that too. And you're okay with that? I smiled at him, feeling a sense of clarity I hadn't experienced since this whole journey began. Marcus, I've been hiding who I am for 3 years. I've been pretending to be smaller, less accomplished, less capable than I actually am. Maybe it's time for the world to see both of us for who we really are. Even if it means our marriage becomes a spectacle, especially if it means our marriage becomes a spectacle. Let them see what it looks like when two successful people try to build something together as equals. Marcus leaned down and kissed me, and for the first time since this whole ordeal began, it felt like a kiss between partners, rather than between a provider and a dependent. I love you, Helen Williams. I love you too, Marcus Chen. Now go call the Attorney General and tell him you're taking the case. The next 18 months were the most challenging and transformative of our marriage. Marcus threw himself into the Richardson case with an intensity that reminded me why I had fallen in love with him in the first place. He worked 18-hour days building a prosecution that would ultimately result in convictions for 15 executives and recovery of over $3 billion in stolen funds. The case made him a national figure, a prosecutor whose name was mentioned alongside the most respected legal minds of his generation. Meanwhile, I found myself navigating the most complex business challenge of my career. The Richardson investigation did indeed put several of my companies under scrutiny, requiring me to unwind partnerships, restructure agreements, and absorb losses that ran into the tens of millions. But it also created opportunities. As Richardson's empire collapsed, I was positioned to acquire valuable assets at steep discounts, ultimately emerging from the crisis stronger than before. The media attention was intense and often intrusive. Reporters dug into our marriage, our finances, our business dealings. They wrote articles about the power couple, whose relationship seemed to defy traditional gender roles. Some praised us as an example of modern partnership. Others criticized us for potential conflicts of interest. Most simply seemed fascinated by the novelty of a marriage where the wife was wealthier than the husband, but the husband was achieving independent success in his own field. Through it all, we learned to be partners in the truest sense. Marcus consulted with me about legal strategies that might affect my business interests, while I provided him with insights into corporate behavior that helped strengthen his prosecution. We supported each other through the stress and scrutiny while maintaining our individual integrity and ambitions. The most telling moment came during Marcus's closing argument in the Richardson trial. I sat in the gallery watching him present a case that he had built through his own intelligence and determination, independent of any help from me. He was brilliant, passionate, and completely himself. The man I had married for his kindness and charm had grown into someone who commanded respect through his own achievements. When the verdicts came back guilty on all counts, Marcus found me in the courthouse hallway. The boy who had once needed to feel like he was supporting me had become a man who could stand proudly beside me as an equal. "How does it feel?" I asked him as we walked to our car through a crowd of reporters and well-wishers. "Like I finally know who I am when I'm not trying to be someone I think you need me to be." "And who is that?" Marcus smiled at me, the same smile that had charmed me at that charity gala years earlier, but somehow deeper and more confident. "Someone who's worthy of being your partner." 6 months later, Marcus was offered the position of State Attorney General. The same week, my acquisition of Richardson's former renewable energy division was approved by regulators, creating the largest clean energy company in the region. We celebrated both achievements together, as partners who had each reached new heights in their respective fields. We also renewed our wedding vows, this time with complete honesty about who we were and what we brought to our partnership. No more illusions about provider and dependent. No more hiding achievements or minimizing capabilities. Just two successful people who had chosen to build something together that was greater than what either could achieve alone. The vows we wrote reflected our journey. Marcus promised to never again assume that loving me meant protecting me from my own strength. I promised to never again hide my capabilities out of fear that they might threaten his sense of himself. We both promised to support each other's ambitions even when they conflicted with our own interests. As we exchanged rings for the second time, I thought about the woman who had sat in that expensive restaurant months earlier, smiling while her husband called her worthless. That woman had been playing a role, hiding her true self behind a mask of dependency and deference. The woman standing at this altar was finally free to be everything she actually was. Marcus had grown too. The man who had once needed to feel superior had become someone who could find strength in partnership rather than dominance. He had learned that true success wasn't about being the most accomplished person in the relationship, but about being worthy of the person you chose to share your life with. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.